Let's jump right in. Whenever we hear about Iran in the news, what's the focus? It's almost always geopolitics, right? Nuclear deals, or the very top tier of the theocracy. But there is a massive, fascinating, and totally hidden power struggle going on right beneath the surface. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking a brilliant analysis by researchers Shora Ismaili and Anna Andreas Malm. They trace the evolution of Iran's labor movements since the 1979 revolution. It's an incredible story about working-class survival and how international conflicts are literally used as a weapon to control everyday people. So, to really get what's happening, we actually need to rewind to the mid-2000s. The authors point out something wild. The first victims of this ongoing internal war, they aren't soldiers on a battlefield. No, they're striking workers locked behind the massive concrete walls and barbed wire of Tehran's infamous Evin prison. And here's the craziest part of all this. These folks weren't just accused of, forming a union or asking for a raise. They were thrown in prison by the hundreds because the state officially accused them of serving a foreign enemy. Now, if you know your history, the authors note this gives off a heavy sense of déjà vu. It really begs the question, how on earth did this cycle start? Like, how do everyday domestic workers suddenly get labeled as foreign traders? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the entire history of the Islamic Republic. Because ever since its foundation, the rulers have used this exact playbook: stigmatize any local pushback by claiming it's secretly funded by external enemies. Let's actually flash all the way back to the 1979 revolution. You might not know this, but the working class was actually the beating heart of that revolution. Their general strike is what really helped bring down the Shah. And right after that, workers formed these totally democratic grassroots councils called shuras to basically run the economy themselves. They took over factories, oil refineries. It was this massive bottom-up experiment. But as you can imagine, total worker control was a huge threat to the brand new Islamist state. So how did the state crush them? Well, September 1980 hits and war breaks out with Iraq. Suddenly, the regime has the absolute perfect excuse. They use that external war to brand any internal dissent, especially those powerful worker councils, as totally unpatriotic. It was brutal. The authors detail how the Revolutionary Guards basically seized on the chaos and the patriotic fever of the war. They literally marched straight into the factories, rounded up thousands of workers who wouldn't comply, and instituted what they called Islamic management. And they did it at the point of a gun. As that war with Iraq dragged on through the 1980s, an entire generation of labor activists was wiped out. Executed in Evin prison, buried anonymously. It just completely decimated the working class organizing of that era. Because of that purge, it actually took a full generation for a new labor movement to finally reemerge around 2004. But wow, it looked completely different. The 1979 movement, that was highly ideological, full of this intense revolutionary fire, aiming to completely control the economy. Fast forward to 2004, and that revolutionary fervor is just gone. The autocratic state isn't crumbling, it's stronger than ever. So this new movement isn't trying to topple the government. It's just a desperate cry for survival. It's about basic, everyday trade union demands under increasingly wealthy, out-of-touch rulers. To give you an idea of just how basic we're talking, let's look at January 2006. 17,000 Tehran bus drivers for the Vahed company decide to go on strike. And what are they asking for? Collective bargaining, a tiny wage increase, recognition of their union. They wanted their leader, Mansour Asanlo, released from prison. Oh, and 2 pairs of shoes for driving. Seriously? 2 pairs of shoes? These are shockingly modest requests for 17,000 people to strike over. But how does the regime respond? With what the authors call the iron fist. The very morning the strike was supposed to kick off, Revolutionary Guards literally swarmed the neighborhoods where these workers lived. They grabbed up to 1,200 bus drivers and even their family members and tossed them straight into Evin prison. They launched a massive military operation just to break a picket line. And, right on cue, just like the 1980s playbook, state media immediately jumps in, labeling these drivers as traitors, carrying out a U.S.-sponsored plot for regime change. Over some shoes and basic rights? Now, this aggressive crackdown wasn't just happening to bus drivers. It was hitting the education sector hard, too. The school teachers in Iran make up a workforce that is overwhelmingly female. We're talking roughly 80%. And according to the research, these women have really been the absolute heartbeat of the post-2004 labor protests. But here's the reality they are facing: 70%. That is the percentage of Iranian teachers who are living completely below the poverty line. Their pay has just plummeted way below the public sector average. They're stuck on terrible temporary contracts, getting paid by the hour. Because of this, a lot of them are literally forced to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep the lights on and feed their families. It is a situation of sheer, grinding economic desperation. But here's what's so inspiring. Despite all of that, they still organized. Back in March 2004, around 300,000 teachers, which is literally a third of the country's entire teaching workforce, went on a nationwide strike. It was actually the first female-dominated labor protest of that massive scale in the entire history of the Islamic Republic. Now, unfortunately, that strike was defeated and the leaders were locked up. But they didn't quit. They pushed through and managed to build the Shura-ye Hamahangi. That translates to an incredibly massive, independent coordinating council that links together 30 different union branches all across Iran. All of that hard work boiled over again in early 2007. After a bunch of nationwide strikes asking for fair, equal pay, union leaders were actually invited to the Ministry of Education. They thought, great, we're finally going to negotiate. Well, actually, scratch that. It was a trap. The very next day, when 10,000 teachers gathered peacefully at the Parliament building in Tehran, they were totally ambushed. Riot police and military forces cordoned them off, attacked the crowd with batons, and arrested at least 1,000 peaceful protesters. So how on earth does a state justify beating up its own school teachers? This is the crucial takeaway. Right before the attack, intelligence officers told the union leaders point blank, in the current climate of sanctions, military siege, and threats of foreign invasion, all further action would be considered security threats. Let that sink in. They literally used geopolitical tension, the threat of the West, as their golden ticket to crush internal demands for fair pay. And that right there perfectly maps out what the authors call the geopolitical trap. It's a vicious cycle. Step 1. Western powers apply aggressive threats and heavy sanctions. Step 2, the regime in Tehran looks around and says, look, we are under siege, the nation is in danger, which lets them play the role of the righteous protectors. And then step 3, because the country is supposedly under threat, any regular worker asking for a living wage gets violently suppressed and labeled as a treasonous security threat. Western confrontational policy literally hands the regime the perfect excuse to crush its own working class. Which really brings us to the core conclusion of all this analysis. You know, when you think about it, the power elites in both the West and in Tehran kind of benefit from this perpetual crisis. The constant threat of conflict keeps those in charge exactly where they are. But the true casualties? It's the everyday people of Iran caught in the crossfire. The bus drivers striking for a pair of shoes, the school teachers working 3 jobs just to survive, people who just desperately need a little breathing room so they can actually remake their own country from the inside out. So, looking back at this entire historical evolution, from the crushed Democratic Worker Councils of 1979 all the way to the arrested teachers and bus drivers of today, we have to walk away asking ourselves a really tough question. Does external military and economic confrontation actually help the Iranian people? Or, by handing the regime the ultimate excuse to label domestic workers as foreign traitors, does it just lock the prison doors even tighter? It's definitely a profound dynamic to keep in mind the next time you're scrolling through the news. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive into Iran's hidden labor movements sparked your curiosity to always look a little deeper.